Something stirs beneath the surface, unseen but never silent. Julia came to the cabin for peace, but instead, she finds wet footprints on the floor and whispers calling to her son. The lake is waiting, and its hunger is endless. It was the summer of 1989, and the thick southern heat wrapped around Savannah like a suffocating blanket. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of damp moss and wet earth, as if the city itself had exhaled a deep breath after years of tension. For Julia, the summer heat felt like the perfect opportunity to escape. After years of dealing with the sharp sting of city life, her husband's death, constant grief, and endless reminders of the life they once had, she sought peace. A break from the noise, a break from the ghosts that lingered in every shadow of her life. Julia found that peace when she stumbled upon a secluded cabin on the edge of a mist-covered lake, hidden deep within the Georgian countryside. She and her son, Jake, could start anew here. No neighbors, no distractions, just the two of them and the distant, eerie hum of the lake. But what Julia did not know, what no one could have foreseen, was that the isolation they sought would be shattered by a presence far darker than either of them had ever imagined. This wasn't a peaceful retreat. It wasn't a sanctuary for healing. The lake, with its foggy veil and deceptive calm, hid more than the secrets of the surrounding forest. It was waiting, watching, and soon it would claim what it had been longing for. The morning after they moved in, Julia found footprints on the wooden floors. Not just any footprints. These were made of water. Cold, damp prints leading in from the door. There was no rain the night before. No explanation. And there was Jake, quiet, staring out the window, whispering something she couldn't quite hear. It was then that the nightmare began. The cabin was an old structure, built long ago, its timbers weathered by time and the relentless forces of nature. The walls creaked and groaned with each gust of wind, but despite the odd noises, it was the perfect getaway. Julia thought it would be just what she and Jake needed. The lake lay like a still mirror outside their window, reflecting the overcast sky above. Thick fog rolled in each morning, adding an air of mystery to the landscape. The surrounding woods were dense, like a curtain hiding whatever secrets the forest held within its depths. On their first evening at the cabin, as the last rays of daylight slowly disappeared beyond the horizon, the air grew thick with the scent of damp earth. Julia, standing by the window, felt a creeping unease that she couldn't explain. It wasn't the kind of unease born from fear or suspicion. It was a feeling that something was just off. As night fell, the eerie silence of the woods deepened. Even the crickets were absent, leaving only the rustle of the wind and the occasional splash of fish in the lake to break the quiet. But as the days passed, Julia tried to shake off the uneasy sensation. She focused on Jake, who was adjusting well to the new surroundings. She found peace in his laughter, the way he explored the nearby woods, always with a sense of wonder and curiosity. But it was the mornings that began to unsettle her. Every single morning, when the fog was thick and the world outside was barely visible, Julia would wake to find footprints on the wooden floor of the cabin. These prints were no ordinary marks. They were formed from water, leaving the wood damp, as though something had walked across the floor without leaving a trace of mud or dirt. Julia would wipe them away, confused but unwilling to jump to conclusions. The air in the cabin would often feel colder than it should, as if a draft had swept in unnoticed. She told herself it was just the cabin's age and the moisture in the air. Jake seemed unaffected, even amused. He spoke about a boy he had seen by the lake, a figure in the fog who called to him. At first, Julia chalked it up to his imagination. After all, children often had vivid fantasies, especially in an isolated place like this. But when Jake began to mention the boy more often, and in a manner that was too detailed, Julia's unease began to grow. It was the next morning that she found the first clue that would lead her down a path she wasn't ready for. As she cleaned the cabin, wiping away the damp footprints, she came across an old newspaper clipping tucked into the corner of a shelf, hidden behind some forgotten books. The article was yellowed with age, its ink faded and smudged, but the headline was clear. Boy drowns in lake, body never found. The article detailed the tragic death of a child named Samuel, who had drowned in the very lake that lay beyond the cabin. The boy had been playing near the water, and despite the frantic efforts to search for him, his body was never recovered. The article ended with a chilling note. Local legend says that Samuel's spirit still haunts the lake, seeking to claim another soul to take his place. Julia read the article over and over again, the words etched into her mind like a tattoo. The boy Jake had described, the one calling to him from the water, had to be Samuel. But what did it mean? Was it just a story? Or was there something darker at play? That evening, as the sun set behind the fog that clung to the water, Julia decided to confront Jake. But when she found him near the shore, his eyes were blank, staring into the distance with an almost unnatural focus. She called to him, but he didn't respond. He was listening to the water. Julia's heart raced as she tried to get closer. There, on the misty shore, she could almost hear it too, a whisper in the wind, soft but persistent, like a distant voice calling from beneath the surface. Something inside Julia snapped. This was no longer about a child's imagination or some old legend. There was something on the other side of that lake, something that had been waiting, watching, and it was now reaching for her son. The days that followed were marked by an eerie stillness that seemed to settle over the cabin. Julia could no longer ignore the cold, unsettling presence in the air, nor could she dismiss the increasing frequency of the strange footprints. Each morning, they would appear on the wooden floor, a trail of wet, waterlogged marks leading from the front door and vanishing into the corners of the room. But what disturbed Julia even more was the way they seemed to grow, becoming more pronounced, deeper, as if something or someone had been walking through the cabin during the night. She had tried to keep herself calm, but the anxiety gnawed at her relentlessly. Every morning she would check on Jake, her eyes scanning his every movement, searching for any sign of distress. But her son seemed oddly distant, his energy drained, as though something invisible was pulling him away from her. He would sit near the window, staring out at the fog-shrouded lake for hours on end, his face expressionless, his small hands gripping the windowsill with white knuckles. He no longer spoke about the boy by the water, but Julia could feel the presence of the child more than ever. It was on the night of July 31st, nearly a week after they had moved into the cabin, that the unthinkable happened. Julia woke abruptly in the dead of night, the silence suffocating her in the way only a still, moonless night could. She lay still in bed, listening, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a sound of faint, rhythmic splashing, barely audible through the walls, but it was there. The unmistakable sound of something moving through the water. Rising from her bed, Julia felt a chill crawl up her spine. Her bare feet made no sound as she moved across the wooden floor, her senses heightened. The moonlight barely pierced the thick fog outside, casting an eerie pallor over the room. She moved toward the window, her breath shallow, her hand trembling as she pulled back the curtain. The sight she saw outside made her blood run cold. There, standing at the edge of the lake, was a figure, a small, childlike shape, just on the edge of the water. It was hard to distinguish in the dim light, but the figure was unmistakably real, its silhouette blurred by the mist rising from the lake. It seemed to be watching her, unmoving, its presence as solid as the trees that surrounded the cabin. But then, as she blinked, it vanished. The figure was gone, swallowed by the fog as if it had never been there at all. Julia stood frozen, the fear settling into her bones like a heavy weight. She waited for the noise to stop, the splashing to cease, but it didn't. The sound grew louder, closer, as if something was walking through the water, moving with purpose toward the shore. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Julia turned and ran to Jake's room. She found him sitting at the edge of his bed, staring out the window with wide, vacant eyes, his face pale and drawn. His hands rested on his lap, fingers clenched tightly as if trying to hold on to something. There was no explanation for the look on his face, but Julia knew, he knew. As she reached for him, Jake finally moved, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that made her stomach twist. He spoke, not in a whisper, but with a calmness that sent a chill through her. He was not speaking to her. He was speaking to something else. Something beyond the walls of their cabin, beyond the fog that clung to the lake. The next moments passed in a blur for Julia, a haze of frantic action, her heart hammering in her chest as she tried to make sense of the terror consuming her. Something was in the water, and it wasn't just the boy calling to Jake. It was something older, something darker, waiting to claim what it needed. The legends weren't just stories. The boy wasn't just a child lost to the lake. He was a harbinger, a vessel for the thing that lay beneath the surface, and it had set its sights on her son. The room seemed to grow colder as Julia tried to pull Jake away from the window, her hands shaking as she gripped his arm. But Jake didn't resist. His eyes remained locked on the fog outside, unblinking, lost to whatever he had seen in the distance. It was then, as Julia turned away, that she caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. A pair of wet footprints, leading from the door to Jake's bed. These footprints weren't just waterlogged. They were damp and fresh, leaving a thin trail of moisture across the floor, as if someone had entered the room. Julia froze in place. Her eyes widened with terror as the realization hit her like a physical blow. The boy wasn't just calling to Jake from the water. The boy had been inside the cabin, and now, whatever it was that waited for him in the depths of the lake had come for them both. The air in the cabin had grown thick, oppressive, as though something had slipped inside and settled among the shadows. Julia moved through the house like a sleepwalker, her body on autopilot, her mind unable to process the sheer weight of the terror that hung around her like a suffocating fog. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to gather Jake and run far away, but there was nowhere to run. The lake, the forest, the air, it all felt wrong, like a trap slowly closing around them. Jake had become withdrawn, his gaze distant, like he was no longer entirely present. He rarely spoke, his eyes perpetually fixed on the lake beyond the cabin's walls. His hands trembled at his sides, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. Julia was afraid for him, afraid of what was taking hold of him, but she couldn't understand it. There was something about his silence that disturbed her more than any words could. It wasn't long before Julia began to notice that the mist, which had always been a constant feature of the lake, was starting to encroach further onto the land. It wasn't natural. The fog thickened at night, rolling into the cabin's yard, moving in like a living thing, wrapping itself around the house and making the trees look like ghostly silhouettes. It was as if the fog was alive, as if it were an extension of something darker, something that had no business being there. One morning, Julia awoke to find Jake standing at the window, his body pressed against the glass. His face was pale, his eyes wide, and his mouth was open in an eerie, silent scream, though no sound came from him. His hands rested against the window, the waterlogged prints now appearing on the glass itself, as though something had reached inside and placed them there. Julia rushed to him, her heart pounding in her chest as she pulled him away from the window, but it was no use. Jake was limp in her arms, his body unresponsive, his eyes staring vacantly at the lake. His skin was clammy to the touch, his breathing shallow and erratic. It was as though his very spirit had been drained from him, leaving behind an empty shell. She could feel the cabin closing in around them, its creaking walls and damp floors seeming to whisper secrets she wasn't ready to hear. But as the days stretched on, she realized that leaving wasn't an option anymore. Whatever had taken hold of Jake was connected to the lake. The mist, the footsteps, the boy. Everything pointed to the water, the dark, unforgiving depths where Samuel had drowned all those years ago. Julia began to research the history of the lake, digging through old town records and forgotten newspapers, desperate to uncover any clue that might help her understand what was happening. She learned that Samuel's death had been a tragedy, but it wasn't the only one. Over the years, several other children had gone missing near the lake, their bodies never recovered. Each disappearance seemed to follow the same pattern. The children would vanish, and shortly thereafter, strange occurrences would begin in the homes of their families. Footsteps, whispers, cold drafts. And then the lake's fog would grow thicker, suffocating everything in its path. The more Julia uncovered, the more she realized that this was no ordinary haunting. The spirit of Samuel had never left the water, and it wasn't content with simply wandering in search of company. It wanted something more. It wanted to complete what it had started, that first unfinished drowning, and it needed a soul to take its place. Jake had become the focus of that need. He was the one who had been chosen. One evening, as Julia stood in the cabin's kitchen, a sudden coldness washed over her. She turned to find the door open, the wooden floor slick with dampness, and the unmistakable prints of water leading out into the yard. Panic rose within her chest as she raced toward the door, her pulse pounding in her ears. She knew, without a doubt, that something was waiting for them. Outside, the fog had thickened to an unnatural degree. It blanketed the world in a suffocating haze, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The air was damp, carrying with it the pungent smell of decay, and the lake was eerily still. Julia hesitated at the threshold, the unease curling in her stomach like a living thing. She called out to Jake, but he didn't respond. She stepped outside, the ground slick with moisture, as she followed the trail of wet footprints that led toward the water. Each step she took felt heavier, as though the earth itself were trying to pull her back, to stop her from going any further. The trail of water seemed to stretch on forever, leading her to the very edge of the lake. And there, standing just at the shore, was the figure. The boy, Samuel. His face was pale, his hair wet and matted, his clothes torn. But his eyes, those eyes, were empty, black, and hollow. He did not move, did not acknowledge her presence. He simply stood there waiting. Julia's breath caught in her throat as she realized, with a sudden and sickening clarity, that the boy wasn't just a ghost. He was a beacon, a lure for whatever dark force resided beneath the surface. The lake wasn't just holding his spirit. It was feeding on the fear, the grief, and the souls of those who ventured too close. And now, Julia and Jake were standing on the edge of its insatiable hunger. The fog rolled across the water, thick and oppressive, as Julia stood frozen at the edge of the lake. The figure of Samuel remained still, his empty eyes locked on hers as if beckoning her closer. Every part of her screamed to turn around, to run, but her feet were planted, as though the earth itself was holding her in place. The moisture from the lake's surface clung to her skin, cold and clammy, and the silence around her seemed to pulse with a presence far darker than anything she had ever known. Her heart pounded in her chest as the coldness in the air deepened. The lake, still as a mirror only moments ago, now began to shift. The water seemed to move unnaturally, rippling with a force that made no sense, as if something below was rising. The mist swirled faster, drawing closer to the shore, and the quiet, unsettling noise of water splashing grew louder, as though something was approaching from the depths. Suddenly, a strange, gut-wrenching sensation surged through Julia. It wasn't just fear. It was something older, something primal. The lake, the mist, the boy. Everything was connected, pulling her toward the water, urging her to step closer. The footprints leading up to the water's edge had become wetter, thicker, as if something had been pacing there just moments before. And now, as Julia stood at the brink of the water, the world around her seemed to fade. The trees, the sky, the cabin, all of it seemed to melt into the thickening mist. Behind her, she could feel Jake, though she did not hear him. She could feel his presence, but it was distant in a way that made her feel utterly alone. Her hands trembled as she reached for him, but he was not there. It was as if he had already been claimed, as if the lake had already taken what it needed from him. Julia turned toward the water once more. She could feel the pull now, the undeniable force drawing her closer. The lake was alive, hungry, and it was pulling at her very soul. She stepped forward, her foot sinking slightly into the mud at the water's edge. The mist parted for a moment, revealing the surface of the lake, and for the briefest of seconds, Julia saw it. The thing beneath the water, the shape that had been waiting for her all along. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. The shape, vast and dark, writhed beneath the surface, tendrils of darkness stretching outward, reaching for the shore. The boy, Samuel, wasn't the spirit at all. He was merely a vessel, a bait, sent to lure souls into the water. The true entity, the dark force that had claimed the lake long ago, was far older, far more powerful than she could comprehend. It had been waiting for a soul, any soul, to come close enough so it could reach up from the depths and claim them. Julia's breath caught in her throat as she watched the tendrils of darkness break the surface of the water. It was as though the lake itself was coming alive, a black abyss rising to meet her. The mist parted once more, revealing the true horror. A massive shape, its surface slick and glistening, its form impossible to define. It shifted, sliding beneath the water's surface as if it were one with the lake itself. The air grew colder, biting at her skin, but Julia couldn't look away. The presence behind her, the thing that had once been her son, now felt distant, lost to the lake's call. Jake was no longer standing beside her. He had already been taken, his soul claimed by the dark force below, his body now just a husk, another pawn in the lake's endless hunger. The thing from the depths surged upward in a violent burst, its form breaking the surface, stretching like dark fingers toward Julia. The mist seemed to swirl around her, choking her as she stumbled backward, the coldness wrapping around her like a vice. Every fiber of her being screamed to run, but she couldn't move. Her legs refused to obey. The water lapped at her feet, the tendrils curling upward as if to pull her into the abyss. And then, a strange and unexpected sound broke through the air. The sound of something snapping, crackling, like a branch breaking under pressure. The lake rippled violently, the fog pulsing like a heartbeat, and in that instant, Julia understood. The thing that had called to her was not the lake itself, but what had been waiting within it. The lake was merely a prison. The thing was bound, locked away by forces she could not comprehend, and the boy, Samuel, was its jailer, its messenger. In the chaotic, horrific swirl of the mist, Julia finally found the strength to break free from the lake's pull. She stumbled back, her body collapsing onto the shore, and the water recoiled as if it were shocked, as though it had not expected her to resist. For a brief moment, the mist parted, and the lake grew still, its surface smooth and calm. The entity, the shape from the depths, disappeared beneath the surface once more, its hunger unsatisfied but momentarily dormant. Julia lay there, gasping for air, her body racked with exhaustion. The weight of what she had seen pressed heavily on her chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. She had narrowly escaped the lake's grasp, but she knew it wasn't over. Whatever force had claimed Jake, whatever had lured him into the water, was still out there, waiting, watching. And as she glanced back toward the cabin, Julia knew that the true horror of the lake had only just begun. The days that followed were a blur of terror and disbelief. Julia, though physically drained, could not bring herself to sleep. Each night, she found herself pacing the cabin, watching the water from the window, waiting for the fog to return, waiting for the darkness beneath the surface to rise again. But it never came. The lake remained still, too quiet, too calm. Julia thought she was safe, but deep inside she knew better. The lake was patient, and its hunger was never truly sated. She tried to leave, to run far away from this cursed place, but the cabin felt like a prison, its walls closing in on her. Even when she stepped outside, the air felt suffocating, as though the land itself were holding her captive. Every time she tried to pack her things, to gather Jake's belongings and escape, something would stop her, an inexplicable pull, a voice, faint and distant, urging her to stay. It was as if the very earth beneath her feet was unwilling to let them go. Julia tried to comfort herself with the thought that she had escaped, that she had survived the worst of it. But her son, Jake, he was gone. No matter how much she searched the cabin, the woods, the lake, she could not find him. She called his name every night, her voice trembling, but there was no response. It was as if he had never existed, swallowed by the same darkness that had taken so many others before him. The fog would sometimes roll back into the yard, curling around the cabin, thickening and rising like a living thing. It was during one of these moments, when the mist was so dense that it obscured her vision, that Julia heard the sound again. The soft, rhythmic splashing, distant but unmistakable. It was coming from the lake. Her heart sank as she recognized the sound. It was the sound she had heard before, the sound that had called Jake to the water, the sound that had dragged him under. Julia stood motionless in the doorway, the fear creeping back into her bones. She knew she should ignore it, turn away, close the door and run. But something kept her rooted to the spot. Her heart whispered a name, Samuel. The boy, the spirit, the lake. She stepped outside, the cold air biting at her skin as the mist wrapped around her like a shroud. Her eyes strained to see through the fog, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps as she moved toward the shore. The splashing grew louder, closer, as if something or someone was waiting for her there. But as she reached the water's edge, something in the mist caught her attention. A figure, a small shape, not quite human, standing at the farthest point of the lake's shore, where the water met the trees. It was a child, silhouetted against the faint light that bled through the fog, and for a fleeting moment, Julia felt a glimmer of hope, thinking it was Jake. But then she saw the face. It was pale, distorted, its features stretched and unnatural. The eyes were wide and empty, hollow sockets that seemed to suck in the very light around them. The body was thin and unnatural, shivering violently in the cold mist. It wasn't Jake. It was Samuel, the boy, his spirit bound to the lake for eternity. Julia took a step back, fear surging through her once more, but the figure didn't move. It stood there, waiting, as if beckoning her to join it. She knew, in that moment, that she would never leave. No matter how far she ran, no matter how hard she tried to escape, the lake would always be there. It would never release its hold. She turned to run back toward the cabin, but the moment she stepped away from the water, a sudden weight pressed against her chest. The air felt heavier, colder. Her legs grew weak, and her vision began to blur. Something was pulling her back. The fog grew thicker, more oppressive, until she could barely see the cabin anymore. With each step she took, the ground beneath her seemed to stretch further away. The trees blurred into shadow, the world around her collapsing inward, and the only thing she could hear was the splashing, the endless splashing, as if the water itself was calling her home. Julia fell to her knees, exhausted and unable to resist any longer. She was drowning in the weight of it all, the weight of the lake, the weight of Samuel's endless thirst, the weight of the darkness that had claimed Jake and so many others before. And as her vision darkened and the water's edge became her only reality, Julia realized the truth. She was never meant to leave. She had never been meant to escape. The lake, the spirit, the dark force beneath it, they had all been waiting for her, and now she too would join the others. She would become part of the lake's eternal hunger. The mist swallowed her whole, and in the distance, the splashing grew fainter. Another soul had been claimed, another life lost to the lake's depths. Days passed in a blur after Julia's disappearance. The fog, once thick and heavy around the cabin, had started to dissipate. The lake's surface was calm once more, but the weight of its stillness was palpable, like a suffocating silence that refused to be broken. The cabin remained empty, the air within it thick with the scent of decay, its walls bearing the remnants of Julia's frantic search for answers, the pages of her research scattered on the floor, half-printed records of the lake's past tragedies. The townspeople, those few who still lived in the area, whispered of the strange occurrences that had plagued the cabin for years. They spoke of the legend of the boy who drowned, his spirit eternally bound to the lake, calling to those who dared to venture too close. They talked about the footsteps that appeared on the floors of the cabin, the mysterious mist that rolled in each night, the strange pull that seemed to drag people into the water, never to return. The lake, with its endless fog and depths that seemed to swallow everything, had claimed its next victim. But this time there was something different, something unsettling. In the months following Julia's disappearance, people began to notice strange things happening in the town. Children who had wandered too close to the woods, families who had moved into cabins near the lake. They began to hear the whispers at night, soft voices calling from the water, beckoning them to come closer. The mist had thickened once again, as if the lake was drawing more souls into its depths. And then, on a foggy evening, a young family moved into the cabin. They were unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded there, unaware of the dark force that still lingered in the water. They had come seeking peace, a fresh start, just as Julia and Jake had once done. But as the family settled in, they too began to hear the whispers. The child of the family, a boy around Jake's age, began to speak of a voice calling to him from the water. He would often wander to the edge of the lake, just as Jake had before him, his feet leaving wet prints on the wooden floors. The fog would roll in at night, thick and suffocating, and the footsteps would appear once more, leading toward the water. The cycle had begun again. Julia's fate had been sealed the moment she stepped onto the edge of the lake, just as Jake's had been before her. The lake was not simply a place of death. It was a force, an ancient hunger that claimed the souls of those it ensnared. It fed on fear, on sorrow, on those who sought solace, and instead found something darker than they could have ever imagined. As the years passed, the cabin would remain abandoned time and time again, each new occupant drawn in by the whispers, the footsteps, the thick fog that hid the lake's secrets. The legend of Samuel would grow, the stories evolving as more lives were lost to the same dark force that had claimed Julia, Jake, and so many before them. And the lake would remain silent and still, waiting for the next soul to approach, to feel the pull of its depths, to become just another part of its endless hunger. It would never stop. It would never let go. The cabin, the lake, the mist, it was all part of the same twisted pattern. A cycle of loss and longing, of empty promises, of things better left forgotten. Julia and Jake were gone, but their story was not over. They were part of something far older, something that had been waiting for them, waiting for anyone foolish enough to seek refuge near its shores. They had joined the lake, and in time, so would others. Years had passed since Julia and Jake's disappearance, and the story of the cursed lake became little more than a whispered legend among the townsfolk. Life had gone on in Savannah, though the town had changed, becoming quieter, more withdrawn, as though the land itself had absorbed the sadness that lingered there. People no longer built homes near the lake, the warnings about the mist and the disappearances more than enough to keep them away. But as with all forgotten things, the legend began to fade. The younger generation had never known the horrors that had once haunted the land. They had never heard the whispers in the night, never seen the waterlogged footprints that seemed to appear out of nowhere. And so, when a young couple looking for seclusion found the old, abandoned cabin, they paid no mind to the warnings or the tales. The cabin, sitting at the edge of the lake, looked almost inviting, surrounded by the quiet, mist-covered water. They were looking for peace, for a fresh start, just as Julia had once been. They arrived on a late autumn evening, the fog rolling in heavier than usual, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The cabin, though abandoned for years, seemed to welcome them, its old wooden floors creaking in the stillness. They quickly made themselves at home, settling into the forgotten space, unaware of the history that lay just beneath the surface. It wasn't long before the strange things began to happen. First, it was the footsteps. Waterlogged prints would appear on the wooden floor, trailing through the rooms as though someone had walked through the cabin, wet from the lake. The couple dismissed it at first, chalking it up to the old pipes or the settling of the house. But then, the voices started, soft, distant murmurs just outside the windows, too faint to be understood. And the fog, the thick fog that seemed to roll in each night, would envelop the cabin, turning the world outside into a blurred, shapeless void. One morning, the young woman woke to find her partner standing at the window, his face pale and his eyes distant. His hands were pressed against the glass, the wet footprints now visible on the window itself, as if something had left its mark from the outside. She felt an uneasy shiver run down her spine. She tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered like a shadow, a creeping suspicion that something was watching them from the lake. The couple began to research the history of the cabin, digging through town records and old newspapers. They uncovered the tragic story of Samuel, the boy who had drowned in the lake long ago, and the strange occurrences that had followed. The more they read, the more they felt as though they were walking into something far darker than they could have imagined. But it was too late. The mist had already begun to return, thicker than ever, swirling around them like a living thing. And they were trapped in its grasp, just as Julia and Jake had once been. It wasn't until one cold, moonless night, when the fog had grown so thick that it obscured everything, that the twist of the lake's hunger revealed itself. The young woman had stepped outside to find her partner, who had vanished without a trace. The coldness of the air bit at her skin, and as she searched the perimeter of the cabin, her heart raced. She knew he was out there, somewhere, lost to the mist. And then, as she stood near the water's edge, something shifted in the fog. A shape, just beyond the lake's surface, something moving beneath the dark water. It wasn't her partner. It was something else, something far older, far more sinister. The thing that had taken Julia, Jake, and countless others before them. And it was waiting for her now. But there was a cruel twist in the way the spirit of the lake operated. The young woman didn't realize it immediately, but the moment she stepped into the mist, the moment she felt the cold touch of the lake's call, she had unknowingly joined the cycle. Her partner, the one who had seemingly vanished into the fog, was no longer lost. He was now part of the lake's insatiable hunger. He had become one with the water, his soul claimed and dragged into the depths, his body now lost beneath the surface. The twist, the horror, was that the lake didn't simply take souls, it transformed them. Those it claimed didn't simply disappear. They became part of the lake's dark essence. And with each new soul, the lake grew more powerful, more insistent in its pull. The boy, Samuel, had been one of the first to become bound to the water. But the spirit of the lake, now living and feeding on countless souls, had found a way to twist its victims, to bring them into the depths, and to force them to wait for the next. They would become part of the dark force beneath the water, forever tied to its hunger, forever condemned to draw others in. As the young woman, now standing at the edge of the lake, felt the weight of the mist surround her, she began to realize too late that her partner had not simply vanished, he had been claimed. And now, she too would join the eternal waiting. She turned to run, but the mist was already closing in, wrapping around her like a chain, pulling her back toward the water. The lake's cold embrace was inevitable. The cycle would continue, and this time, she would be its new face. As the mist swallowed the young woman whole, she felt the suffocating weight of it close in around her, wrapping its icy tendrils around her chest, her limbs, her heart. The darkness of the lake seemed to stretch endlessly before her, pulling her in deeper and deeper, as if it had always been waiting. The faintest sound of water splashing reached her ears, the same eerie, rhythmic noise that had called to so many before her. In that final, fleeting moment before the lake consumed her completely, she understood the terrible truth. The lake wasn't just a place of death. It was a force, a hunger that had existed long before the town had been built, long before Samuel's tragic drowning. The lake had been waiting for souls to claim, waiting for those who sought peace, only to find the dark, endless abyss that would never let them go. It was a force older than time itself, and the cycle of loss and longing had been repeating for as long as anyone could remember. Julia, Jake, and countless others had been consumed by it. They had become part of the lake's twisted existence. And now the young woman and her partner, just like all those before them, would join the endless line of souls that would be drawn to the water's depths, waiting to lure the next victim in. But there was something more sinister at play. The horror of the lake lay not just in its endless hunger, but in its ability to twist those it claimed, to turn them into something else. The spirits of the lost souls were not simply drifting in the darkness. They were waiting, forever bound to the lake, forced to draw in others. They could never leave, could never escape the pull of the water. The young woman, now consumed by the fog, felt a terrible change beginning. The hunger that had once belonged to the lake was now within her. She had become part of its twisted existence. And as her body was pulled toward the water, she understood her role. She would now be the one calling out to others, the one whose presence would lure the next soul to the lake. She would become part of the cycle, just as Julia had become, just as Jake had before her. In the distance, the fog parted, revealing a new shape at the water's edge. The faintest glimmer of a figure, another lost soul waiting to be claimed. The cycle would continue, and the lake's hunger would never be satisfied. The legend of the lake, the whispers of the spirits, the splashing in the water, they were all part of something far darker than any one person could have imagined. It was a force that would never stop, never let go. It would always be there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the next victim to approach. And as the mist thickened once more, the lake claimed another soul. Another story was added to the endless, twisting cycle. The horror of the lake would live on, eternal and unyielding, until the end of time itself.